Hola, bueno, ya llegando al final de la NotPink, nuestra tercera edición, vamos a presentarles la última charla de Ailey Mellen. Lamentablemente, Ailey tuvo un problema personal y va a estar con nosotras y con nosotros en esta última charla contestando las preguntas en el Q&A, pero bueno, tuvo un problemita personal y vamos solamente a ver su charla y después volvemos para hacer un pequeño cierre. Así que bueno, les cuento que Ailey trabajó muchos años en ciberseguridad, ha sido reconocida mundialmente por sus investigaciones. Durante los últimos 10 años ocupó diferentes puestos en ingeniería, desarrollo y consultoría de IT, obtuvo un título de ingeniería informática y actualmente escribe sobre sus investigaciones en Cyber Reason. Hoy nos va a presentar su charla sobre la influencia de la guerra cibernética o cyber warfare sobre las elecciones mundiales. Así que les comparto la charla de Ailey y bueno, lamentablemente no va a estar, pero siempre presente. Espero la disfruten.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trust But Verify, Maintaining Democracy in Spite of Information Countermeasures. My name is Allie Mellon. I'm a security strategist in the office of the CSO at CyberReason. I've spent the last decade in various tech roles. I spent several years of that in security, working on my own security research, and now I spend my time looking to advance security, think about the future of security, and also help implement that in our own organization. And I want to start the presentation talking about what's truly critical to our daily life, because this plays into voting more than one might think. And so automatically, when I think about what's really critical to our daily life, I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This pyramid encompasses all of the things that Maslow suspects that we need in order to reach self-actualization and achieve our full potential. The base of that pyramid are the physiological needs. These are things like air, water, food, all of the things that you really absolutely need in order to just have life. But above that actually comes that safety element, things like personal security, employment, any of the resources that you need to really live. A layer above that, you come into belonging, things like friendship, intimacy, that sense of connection that you get from being a part of a community. And above that, you have esteem, things like respect and status, recognition, and of course, self-esteem as well. And this is all leading up to self-actualization and becoming the most that one can be. You need all of these things to reach that top of the pyramid. And so my question is, where does voting fit into that? Not necessarily as something that you need to live, but as something that you have all of these needs that need to be met before you're actually willing to go vote. And at CyberReason, we've been actually identifying this through what we call Operation Blackout Protect the Vote. These are a series of exercises that I've taken part in and organized for the past 2 years with members of the FBI, Secret Service, and other law enforcement officials across the world. And in these exercises, we actually take ethical hackers, we put them against law enforcement in a tabletop exercise where the hackers are trying to attack the election and the law enforcement is trying to protect it. It's usually set over the course of just election day, and it's really meant to help us better understand what law enforcement is prepared for and what they aren't, so that we can improve those processes. No actual hacking is done, but the point is really to understand where law enforcement is lacking in order to make it better. We see this a lot for those of you who are in the security industry with red teaming, where the red team is actually looking to attack and infiltrate an organization in order to ultimately make it more secure. That's all that we're doing in these exercises. And one of the key points of the exercises is that we do it in such a way where we do not actually attack the voting equipment or those things that we would classically consider to be related to voting infrastructure, like the actual polling stations themselves, the machines, There's a plethora of research being done on that, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're trying to look at a more encompassing view. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with the defender perspective, really dig into the daily life of a voter before using that information to think about things from the attacker perspective. From there, I really want you guys to be thinking about and brainstorming throughout this entire process. What could you do to stop an election if you wanted to? Whether it's hacking, whether it's using some other means, what could you do to stop or cause chaos during an election? And this will really naturally lead into a conversation about how we can actually use that information to then protect our elections, which is the goal for all of us here. So let's dive into the defender perspective. What we've seen at a government level is election infrastructure is really limited to voter registration databases, IT infrastructure systems, voting systems, all of these things that are not really comprehensive of the greater picture. They're very limited down into the actual voting systems that we're using. But the question that I have is that really all? Is that really all that we should be thinking about here? And throughout the course of these exercises, what we found is that it's not. And instead, we can think about voting through its own hierarchy of needs, much like Maslow's pyramid. Now, this pyramid actually addresses Maslow's hierarchy of needs and is pretty closely linked to it. For example, with physiological needs, we're talking about things like life and death and property. Without these things, you're much less likely to go vote. If you're afraid for your safety, probably not going to go vote. If you are losing your home, you have bigger priorities considering rather than going to vote. Similarly, with things like safety, if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like your family is healthy, it makes it much more difficult to go be willing to vote. Unless there is something that seems so critical about voting that you're motivated to do it. And then also belonging. If you don't feel like you belong in the community or the country that you're in, you are much less likely to go vote for some candidate because you don't feel like you're a part of the system. And then, of course, esteem. This comes into play in a lot of areas, but particularly if you don't feel like your vote matters, which we know a large portion of the population does not feel like their vote matters, that it's just one vote in a sea of votes. If you feel that way, then you are much less likely to vote. And that is something that we've seen time and time again. And then, of course, self-actualization, being the best that you can be. If you feel like you are not the best person that you can be, or like you're not at that point, then you're much less likely to go vote. And all of this comes into what I consider the voter hierarchy of needs. These are, as I said, all of the things that you need in order to feel safe and comfortable going to vote. So when we think about election infrastructure, well, my question is that really all? Or are we having a very narrow definition tied to the voting machines themselves that doesn't encompass all of the factors to consider when you're dealing with human beings who have other priorities, day jobs, other concerns? Because you have all of these systems that you now need to protect in order for people to feel safe enough and comfortable enough to go vote and motivated enough. So these systems to protect actually become systems that are a target. And in a nation like the United States, where 40% of eligible citizens do not vote at all, any kind of voter suppression has impact on an election. Any. So there are other elements to election infrastructure that relate to voter suppression, faith in government, and other factors. And what I want to get at here is that there are other ways to influence an election than attacking the voting machines. And voter suppression is ultimately an attack on democracy. So let's jump into the attacker perspective and really get a better idea of what can be attacked. And again, I really want to point out that this isn't evil. To jump into the attacker perspective isn't evil. It's why we red team, and it's really important to making sure that we are prepared for unexpected situations. So attackers targeting an election are motivated by one of three things. The first is potentially gaining power. And we see this with countries like the United States and like Russia. Second is to spread a particular ideology. And we've seen this again with many, many countries. A good example is China. And then the third is to maintain their global recognition and support, and to push their own agenda. So when I think about cyber attacks, we actually at Cyber Reason, our CSO likes to think about them as three different layers. And so I stole this from him, and I really like this way of thinking about it. You can attack three different layers with a cyber attack: the infrastructure plane, the information plane, or the ethos plane. And the ethos plane, that's that belief system. The information plane is the actual communication that you're getting. And then the infrastructure plane, that's that physical layer. Things like the electric grid, public transit, physically stopping everyday activities. And what I want to do is start by talking about some attacks on the ethos plane. And we're going to take some modern day examples, but also some historical examples in this part of the talk. So again, ethos plane, that's that belief system. Bear that in mind as we go through this. And I want to start with the Italian elections of 1948. 1948 was a big time for election interference. The US government was intent on psychological warfare, and millions of dollars was going to Christian democratic and right-wing socialist parties in Italy at this time in order to sway their election. There was a massive propaganda campaign against communist and socialist coalitions. And the goal was to change the perception of the election into one of democracy versus totalitarianism, and Christianity versus atheism, America versus the Soviet Union, and of course, abundance versus starvation. And they actually were able to sway the outcome of the election. This was so effective that they actually repeated this process in multiple countries, including Guatemala, South Vietnam, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and many, many more. Another example is Moscow, where they actually founded the Communist International Party in 1919, and they used that to urge the American Communist Party to pursue revolutionary regime change in the United States. This can be considered very similar to the democracy promotion later pursued by Washington. And while this isn't a direct impact on an election, the goal is to sway that belief system for future elections and to push that point of view. Another example that crosses several lines is the 1996 Chinese influence on the US election, where a Chinese general sent $300,000 to the Clinton campaign because they were interested in influencing the US presidential election. Now, let's look at some more modern attacks, and we'll start with social media. On the right, we have an example here of a Facebook ad, or Facebook post, where someone is talking about who's behind the mask. Like and share if you want the burqa banned in America. The goal is really to push this message of divisiveness and to make people feel like this is a common sentiment in the US, whether or not it is. On the left, you can see what's both a ethos attack and an information attack, because it is a Twitter post saying, save time, avoid the line, vote from home, which of course you cannot vote from home. But people might take this and say, oh, the government is being so helpful, we can now vote from home, we don't have to go in, especially during times of a pandemic. This could be very helpful. When in reality, this is not a way to vote. And, one of the problems that I want to highlight here is we're seeing companies that are justifying misinformation and disinformation as free speech. And the way that the argument is framed makes it seem like this is a fair point. But the reality of the situation is that we are struggling in many countries to handle misinformation and disinformation. And it is so vast and so important that it is more than just a government issue, and social responsibility for these individual organizations needs to be paramount. Next, we're going to look at the information plane and some historical examples from that. And this one is particularly interesting because I want to start off by talking about the foundations of America, specifically Sam Adams and disinformation. Now, disinformation and misinformation, they're obviously not new ideas, but it was baffling to me to learn the depths to which they are very much so not new ideas. America was actually founded on the premise of a conspiracy theory. Sam Adams argued that Britain's taxations were part of an elaborate conspiracy to eventually enslave American colonists. He spread that and other early disinformation through pamphlets and speeches that contained information he knew was untrue, but continued to spread it in order to gain power, in order to spread the type of thinking that he wanted to spread. And he actually used the Boston Massacre to that end as well. So when we think about disinformation, especially in the United States, but in other countries as well, we need to consider the fact that, one, this is not something new. This is not a new problem. And two, some of our countries were founded on this, which is something that it makes you reconsider how you view disinformation in the world and where we're starting from. Next, I also want to talk about the CIA and the propaganda asset inventory. This was in the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War era. There were a lot of different radio stations and magazines and newspapers that the U.S., the CIA was in control of. In a particularly interesting instance, as you can see with these balloons, the CIA was in control of Radio Free Asia, and they realized that many Taiwanese citizens did not have access to a radio as private citizens. So they actually strapped radios to balloons in an attempt to fly them over to Taiwan so that citizens would get access to the radio. Needless to say, the balloons went the wrong direction. But the story is interesting just for the fact that they tried this. And then also, another interesting story is a magazine that the CIA actually had control of called Forum World Features. And the magazine became so popular that they started to distribute it in the US. So the CIA had to be very careful not to accidentally place false stories in the US magazine. Very disturbing. And of course, hardly a left-wing newspaper in Europe wasn't financed directly from Moscow. This was again in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Another example is US radio in Moscow from the time of 1976 to 1982. A lot of rock music, which was not available in Moscow, the US would actually stream on this radio station, things like Elton John, the Beatles, and they spent a lot of time playing this music, and then on the breaks they would follow it up with quote-unquote editorial content, which Soviet authorities considered disinformation. But people still listened to it in Russia because they wanted the music. Now, this one is particularly interesting because it is an actual example from Election Day where faith in the election was attacked. So 3 or 4 days before the election in Ukraine, the attackers actually compromised the CEC network. So they were able to disable vote counting. And this is immediately losing faith in your government, losing faith in how effectively your government is going to be able to count the votes of this election and the actual integrity of the election. They were able to get it back up and running in about 12 hours, but still, a few days later, on actual election day, this was May 25th in 2014, they underwent a constant denial of service attack on the CEC website. And actually 12 minutes before the polls closed, attackers posted a picture of the former leader of the right sector on the CEC website, claiming that he won the election, which was then shared widely by Russian media. Almost as if it was planned. Almost. Now, let's look at some of these attacks on communication that are more modern, and we're seeing in the 2016 election and frequently even now. On the right-hand side, you can see this helpful message supposedly coming from the US government that is giving someone their polling location. However, this is not a legitimate polling location. They're trying to send someone to the wrong place. Because ultimately, if you get sent to the wrong place and it makes you late for work, you're probably going to be frustrated. You're probably not going to want to try and find where your actual polling location is. And then on the left, you can see an example of a message supposedly coming from President Trump saying that your ballot has not yet been submitted. This is a tactic used to shame someone from voting, and it's not actually from the campaign. Now, let's look at the infrastructure plane. This one is my favorite. I think it's super interesting, the connection between cybersecurity and actual physical installments. So there are quite a few examples in here, and we'll start again with those historical ones. First, let's talk about an assassination of Lumumba. So the Democratic Republic of Congo was created and gained its independence in 1960. At that time, Lumumba was elected as the prime minister. And he was shortly after he was assassinated in 1961. Now, while this was not directly related to an election, it was politically fracturing for this new independent nation. And it was actually the assassination was put on by the American and Belgian governments. This is the type of thing that can really strongly impact people's faith in their elections, faith in their government, and fear that they can have their own opinions or be taken seriously or run for office and not be killed. And let's talk about another example in 1965 where the Communist Party actually finished fourth in an Indonesian election. They were offered a proportional representation in the government, as is typical, but the US was not happy about this. They did not feel like having communists even having a proportional representation in government would be good for Western interests. And so they secretly supported the purge of suspected communists, and thousands to millions of people died over months. The military then took over as the most powerful institution in the country. And this is the type of thing that obviously has immediate impact because people have been killed, but it also terrifies the public. Who is voting freely in their country after something like this happens? That's the question. And while it may not be directly related to cybersecurity at this point, think about how much easier it is to secretly support and push for the purging of a specific group in a country when you have access to disinformation campaigns, misinformation campaigns over the internet that can be done very covertly. And next I want to talk about the Bronze Night. This, again, was not on election day, but gives a great example of what could happen on election day, tying in those physical aspects with the cyber aspects. So, the Bronze Night was a day in Estonia where they actually moved a Red Army soldier to a Soviet cemetery instead of being in the center of the capital. And because they didn't want to have a Red Army soldier in the middle of their capital, which I think makes a lot of sense. Anyway, fake news started to spread, with Russian news reports claiming that the statue and Soviet war graves were being destroyed while this was happening. And this resulted in 2 nights of riots and looting. 156 people were injured, 1 person died, and 1,000 people were detained. But at the same time, on the infrastructure side, banks, media outlets, and the government was hit by a denial of service attack. So that meant that cash machines and online banking was completely out of service. Government employees were unable to communicate via email, and newspapers and broadcasters were completely unable to deliver the news. This is the type of attack that really combines that infrastructure and information plane in order to cause a lot of chaos, cause injury, and in some cases death, and just wreak havoc on the government and the individual citizens. As this quote, I think this quote really represents this idea that cyber is really, it just spreads confusion covertly. You don't even see it, but you can incite people and incite different things in order to further your message. Now, with physical attacks in modern times, we can look at things like the electric grid. This is one of the ones that I find very potentially scary. For example, in 2003, a 4-day power outage left at least 100 people in the United States and Canada dead. If there is a power outage happening in your city or in your specific district or whatever the case may be, you are going to be more worried about what's going bad in your fridge than you are going out to vote. And some people this is not the case for. Some people will still want to go out and vote, but in reality, you have a lot more priorities in this situation than going to vote. And next, on that physical side, I want to look at transit. Because if you are unable to actually get to a polling place with public transit or your car or whatever the case may be, it makes it a lot more difficult to want to go and vote. And let's not forget, in 2016, when San Francisco's transit system was infected with ransomware. Now, if something like this happened, say it's a normal day, we're not during a pandemic, and you go to work, you take public transit to work, you spend your day reading the news, potentially accidentally reading some disinformation, and you reach the end of the day and your plan is to go take the train to the polling station on your way home. But you go to the train and the train is shut down because of a ransomware attack or a denial of service attack or whatever the case may be. Are you going to still try to go to the post office or still try to go to the polling station, or are you going to give up, be frustrated, and just go home because you've had a long day of work and it feels like the day should be over anyway? A lot of people would take that as a sign that they should not go. So what we're seeing is we can attack each layer in order to actually attack every part of the voter hierarchy of needs. Now let's shift back to the defender perspective to think about where this actually leaves us. And in the United States right now, and in many countries right now, we continue to have this very narrow view of election security, where election infrastructure is limited to voter registration databases, IT infrastructure, etc. This leads to things like this. public officials coming out and saying that we are just going to have to confront distortions and fake stories. Presidents saying that they're trying to steal an election and this is a huge scam. And even top congressional Democrats saying that this information is going to be amplified during this election and we need to be prepared for it. And while it's great to be publicly releasing these statements, it doesn't give voters the tools that they need to prevent it. It's making a statement, oh, by the way, we're going to be struggling with all of this stuff, but we have no solution for you. We have no way for you to actually not have to deal with something like this. So the question is, given everything that you've learned today in this talk, where should we really be going? What should election security look like in order to actually take into account all of the different aspects that we've been talking about? And this is how I view it. I view election security as a combination of things like defending communication, defending social media, transit, the electric grid, and other different things in order to give a more holistic and complete view of election security, and in order to give voters much more confidence in their ability to vote during election day. Now, there is an interactive portion of this exercise. So I want you guys to think about what your election day looks like. And I'll start from my side by just answering these questions. I do vote before work, which makes it super convenient because I just get up. It's the first thing I do in the day and I feel accomplished. But this year, I am actually going to mail in a ballot. I've applied for mail-in voting. I'm a huge supporter of mail-in voting, especially right now, given the current circumstances. It obviously comes with its own threat model, but the importance of preparation and thinking ahead and removing the ability to make these time-based attacks is key. Now, of course, modern events do change this. I do not want to wait in a polling station when people could be sick. And I am on Twitter, and I do try to fact check as often as I can, unless it's from a trusted source, and then I may not. But the majority of times I do, and I look for certain things and say, well, this doesn't seem realistic. Well, this is telling it as if there's only one side to the story, things like that. So how would you attack? What would you do to each of these layers? Would you take out the electric grid in specific areas that are known to swing Republican or Democrat? Would you take out transit in as many districts as possible? What are the different things that you would do? Which layers would you attack? And then I want you to use that brainstorm to think about how you can actually protect it, both at a citizen level, at an organization level, and at a government level. How would you actually defend democracy given these new constraints around what election security truly means? And I want to leave you guys with some thoughts on what we can do to protect democracy. Because in a lot of ways, it seems like a problem that we don't have much control over. But I would argue that that is not the case. Because a lot of these different forms of election security infrastructure in this new definition are privately owned. So whether you're in the government or in the private sector, you need to take security seriously. Examples of that are social media. Many all social media networks in the US at least are owned by private companies, and they need to be taking security seriously. Similarly, some utilities are privately owned in the United States and in other countries, and some forms of transit as well. All of these people need to take security seriously in order to defend election day. And so a part of that is to work closely with the government, develop relationships. If you aren't a member of InfraGard, but you work at a critical infrastructure provider, I highly recommend that you join. It's a public-private partnership with the US government, if you're in the US, and try to look it up if you're not in the US, what your country does to interface between the public and private sector. And then the last one is to do what you can to fight misinformation. Post things factually. Don't retweet things that are fake news. Try to read up on situations and modern life and everything going on in politics so that you can be the voice of truth in a world that is very tied to falsehoods. Now, I've created a white paper on all of this work, and it is free to download, no gating. You can just go to that link and start reading it. So please do. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. My information is in the PDF, so you should be able to reach out to me. Thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions, please reach out, send messages in the chat, and follow me on Twitter @HackerBella. Feel free to email me, and it was great being here. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Ok. Bueno, le súper agradecemos. Gracias, Ailey, por el video que nos mandó. Lamentablemente, como les dije al principio de su presentación, por un tema personal no pudo estar, pero nos hizo llegar su video. Por eso no vamos a tener preguntas, porque no puede estar, pero sí en el Discord están, y bueno, la charla, como les dije, esta, que fue la última, como todas las anteriores, van a estar en nuestras redes sociales, tanto en Twitch como en YouTube se van a estar subiendo. Les súper agradecemos por haberse quedado con nosotras en esta tercera edición. En este momento vamos por finalizada al track 2, y los invito al track 1, donde está terminando su charla Yamina Levalle. No se la pierdan porque está genial, una genia ella. Y luego vamos a hacer la entrega de los premios y presentando también, haciendo el cierre final. Bueno, nada, no los puedo ver ni no las puedo ver. Brindo por ustedes. Cheers, salud y nada, gracias. Gracias totales. Muchas gracias.